Hello and welcome to the Essential Property Podcast with your hosts, Paul Samuda and Amanda Woodward. With 45 years of combined experience in the world of property buying, selling, investing and developing, they are here to share with you their knowledge in the Stoke-on-Trent, Newcastle-under-Lyme and Crewe property market. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Essential Property Podcast. My name's Amanda and I'm here with my co-host Paul Samuda talking all things property in the Stoke-on-Trent, Newcastle-under-Lyme and Crewe area. Now today we are going to be talking about the private rented sector and some relevant surveys that have been taking place with the BBC that I'm sure that some of our listeners will be aware of. And we're going to be having a general catch up of the markets and actually reflecting on about a year or so now since we first launched the podcast and what's happened during that period as well. So to kick off, there has been a lot of talk about the BBC's survey in conjunction with Property Mark to talk to agents and to talk to landlords about the sector, why they think that landlords are exiting the market or some landlords are exiting the market, and why we now start to have an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. So there's been some controversial comments around the survey, some people saying that the answers to the survey are obvious and there's some obvious reasons why landlords are exiting the market. But I think it's important that we share our experience and feedback of what we're seeing in the market as well. So I'm going to ask you a question, Paul, to kick off in terms of it's really been going on for the last couple of years, let's be honest. It's now just starting to become sort of, in the main. Why are some landlords, and I stress some, taking the decision to exit rather than remain in the private rented sector?
Amanda, I actually can't believe that we're on episode 23, to be fair. Where's the time gone? We're well into our second year and so many things have happened. And now this, I have to say I'm one of the cynics. When the BBC announced that they're doing a survey, you think, why are the BBC doing a survey? Are they doing a program? Are they going to do a We Hate Landlords program? What's that all about? But I think you touched on it. I think it's quite simple. I think it's straightforward. Landlords, their job is to provide accommodation and to make a profit. A lot of landlords had bought property to replace a very poor non-performing pension for which they were paying very expensive management charges. And they took the view that they could do a better job in securing their future. And then our friend, George Osborne, came along and said, we're going to make it difficult for all you landlords that own property in your personal names by taxing you. So that's the first reason. That's the biggest reason. If you're not making any money, why would you want to stay in the sector? If the only way you can make money is on growth, and during a very, very horrible time during the pandemic, you were told that you have to suck it up, not chase after rent, not evict tenants, but basically you need to fund that. That's going to leave a sour taste in some landlords' mouths. So they're going to say, do you know what? I've had enough of this. I think the government made a poor calculation or an incomplete calculation by sucking it to landlords that provide comfortably over 20% of the housing stock to the country. Why did they think that was not going to have an effect? That a landlord was going to roll over and say, yeah, fine, we'll pay more taxes, we'll, not collect rent, do all these things, we'll be border control aficionados for the government, we don't mind. Why do they think that's not going to have a negative effect? So landlords have voted with their wallet, voted with their feet and said, look, I've had enough. What our wonderful government hadn't considered, that was going to have quite an aggressive reduction in stock for people that want to rent. Because remember the other thing they were doing, right? They were pushing for first-time buyers. They had lots of incentives for first-time buyers. So you've got a double whammy. So you've got landlords exiting. All those rental houses, or a lot of those rental houses potentially bought by first-time buyers. So that puts a double squeeze on the rental stock. So renters come along and say, look, I want to rent a house. My budget's, in our case, in Stoke-on-Crewe, £400. And the letting agent says, yeah, you'll get a studio for that now. It's now £550 for starters for a 2 up, 2 down. And that's the effect. So I don't think you have to do a survey. I think it's straightforward. If every commercial company, when something didn't go right, did a survey to work out, it means that they don't know their product. They don't know what they're doing. So I don't think you need to sell. I think it's obvious why landlords are exiting. I mean, landlords exit every year because, they've come to the end of their mortgage or they're retiring, and that's normal. But definitely I've seen some of the numbers, and there's definitely been a run for the exit because they've said this is just not worth it anymore. Interest rates are going up. We're probably going to talk about it a little bit later. Interest rates are going up. That's another reason. There was an article in the Financial Times this weekend. And when you work out between the extra taxes you're paying and interest rates going up, I think interest rates go up by another 1.5%, and you're losing money on your typical 70-75% loan to value mortgage on a buy to let. So it's a problem. It's a problem. It's a problem for the government in terms of what do we do? How do we house all these people that need to rent? Where are they going to get the money from to pay these increased rents? And, the last thing the government wanted to do is to admit they got it wrong and reverse what they believe is a good decision. Landlords are now doing service accommodation. They've always done service accommodation. This isn't new, but there's an underlying demand for short stay accommodation because people's holidaying habits and travel habits have changed. No longer is short stay accommodation just for hotels or B&Bs. It's changed. And landlords have said, we'll invest in our property and change that. And that puts a little bit of pressure on the housing stock. Government's not happy about that. And my guess is that they're going to probably look at some point to reflect their distaste for that move, because that's what governments do. So I'm ranting. I'm never happy when it comes to government involvement. So there you go.
That is a little bit of a rant. But the statistics I don't have to hand in terms of percentage, but with regards to the number of landlords in the private rented sector who only own one property is huge. So let's just say the majority of are sort of one or two property owners rather than portfolio owners.
I'm going to say 40%. I think it's 40%.
Really? Okay, I thought a little bit higher, but okay.
That's a lot. That's significant, yeah.
So it only takes one or two things to happen for that person to say it's just not worth it for me. And I think the real stinger during COVID was the restrictions with regards to non-paying tenants and evictions. And I think it goes without saying that all landlords had an element of empathy within the first sort of few months of COVID, as everybody was suffering to a degree. But the government certainly said it's okay, landlords can just carry this one for us. And, we did also have a scenario, we're not immune to it. But unfortunately, we had a gentleman that wanted to play the game, so to speak. And 6 or 7 months later and quite a few £1,000s later, only did we manage to resolve that situation. So if you've only got one property and you've had 6 or 12 months of no income and you have increased costs, like you say, Paul, just the bitterness and the resentment, I guess, you just say, look, I'm done. I've got some equity in there. I'll sell, I'll take my equity and I'll move on to something else. A part of the question in the survey, because I did actually complete it, was around short-term lets. So I was quite vocal in my responses to the survey in terms of the reasons why landlords are unhappy, I'm going to say, because we don't exit the market in any shape or form. Paul and I are property collectors, net buyers, and we're definitely not exiting ourselves. But it mentioned in there about how many properties have you converted from residential to short-term lets, how many of your landlords or other landlords that are converting their property to short-stay lets. So I thought that was, like you say, I was a little bit cynical around that in terms of, the BBC and perhaps the government and how they're going to present that. But property isn't immune to just the reality of and the trends of what's taking place in the country. And like you say, if there is a move towards a change in behaviour, then the property market's going to reflect that, and the government can't stop that or stem that, really.
Well, you say that. I mean, governments, as has been proved fairly recently with regard to this little skirmish, in inverted commas, on the continent, can do a great deal. They can influence changes in the law, which we have seen in HMO licenses, we have seen with regard to the tax system. So, the government doesn't want their agenda, it doesn't matter which government, affected, and housing is seen to be a basic right in this country. And if it is made more difficult because properties are being converted to people that live and work in the area, to be presented for people that are out of area who are there in a transient way, and that affects the ability for local people to find housing, then the government's going to have something to say about it. If you read about areas down in Cornwall and some of those holiday places, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. It's all about finding the balance, because there's a desire to service people when they come into the area. There's also a desire to ensure that the local population have good housing. Where that balance is, I think neither you or I know. I don't think the government knows. But I think what is important is that, I'm probably a proponent where I prefer the government to be more hands-off rather than hands-on. But an organization like Shelter, is the other extreme. I think there's a role for short stay for a whole bunch of reasons. We provide short stay management, and our landlords like the benefits, like the fact that it slots in with longer stays. It's an alternative for people arriving into the area. It's cost effective, it's competitive. I don't suppose the hotels like it because it prevents the hotel from jacking up their rates. But it gives choice, and offering choice is never a bad thing. But the flip side of that, it does crowd out some of the rental options for the local population. In terms of our objective is to provide the best service we can to our landlords, both in terms of podcasts like this and in terms of the management that we do. And, during the lockdown period, there was no such thing as service accommodation because that was banned. So that's one of the downsides to service accommodation. The buy-to-let, the normal residential was fine, but you could not offer a SA facility because of the risk of COVID, unless there were essential workers. So that's part of the risk, and there's other risks involved. So, landlords take a view, and they look at the risk, and they look at the returns, and they'll take a view. And I think in a democracy, in a system where pro-capitalist, I think that's what you do, and we should be left to be able to do that. There are some local authorities, there are some MPs that want something pretty much the opposite of that, rent controlled and all that sort of stuff, and I'm not for that. But property has always been a hot potato because it's the basic human need, and it's always going to be a political hot potato, and government's going to try and get it right. I think all we can do in terms of our communication, in terms of helping our landlords, is to direct them where the most profitable activity happens, where the opportunities are. We can assist them directly or indirectly, or just signpost them and make them aware of any new legislation, any new risks, and things like that. I mean, one of the things we're going to talk about, it's been probably 6 months now since Article 4 in Crewe. And that's been interesting. It's been like stony silent in terms of activity. There was a little bit of activity around the deadline of 1st of November, some ridiculous activity, we think, because they were flexing their muscle in terms of you've missed the deadline, so therefore you can't operate. And then ever since that, it's been like silence. So it's a funny old time.
It is. I've been keeping an eye on the planning portal for Crewe with regards to HMO applications that are still being presented, and the feedback from the local sort of councillors and committees obviously is exactly the same as it was before, extremely anti. I saw an application go in for a fully renovated, beautifully converted HMO, big rooms, en suites, right next to the train station. And the feedback is that it is poor, inadequate accommodation, and recommended that it be obviously just thrown out of planning. So we'll see. I'm keen to see if any manage to work their way through to see if it is a completely closed door or if the door has been left ajar. So just time will tell with regards to that.
Just to interrupt, that's interesting. So who said that it was not fit for purpose? Was it the planning officers or was it the local councillors?
After about 3 months, the planning case officer hadn't commented, and a date hasn't even been set for the case to be decided on. And this was all of the hubbub from the local councillors. There was a subcommittee created to discuss it, and the results were posted, and it was all the usual: poor accommodation, poor parking, etc., etc., etc. But that wasn't an official committee, but that was a sort of a subcommittee that got together to put forward their points. So just more of the same, really. But we know that's the case. That's why Article 4 was put in place in Crewe, sort of the anti-HMO mission. So again, we will see how the cases are determining them.
Yeah, it's probably going to be like that for at least the first year until it settles down. I think once people realise that housing becomes a problem, I mean, we forget that HMOs are affordable housing.
Yeah.
It's affordable housing. It's in the long-term development plan for Crewe and Stoke. We need more affordable housing. So if you cut off, 15% of Crewe as an area in terms of providing HMOs, that eventually is going to have some sort of knock-on effect on the affordable housing stock. Now, I don't know whether councillors get that detailed in terms of their assessment, or whether they say, look, there's too much rubbish piled up outside of these HMOs. I mean, we'll see what happens after year one, because it's brand new, fresh, brand new. And I guess some of the planning officers aren't even sure what they should or shouldn't be doing, and whether they want to take a chance, for fear of falling foul of the councillors, which is not supposed to be the case, but in practice that is.
There has already been some impact, though, because our occupancy has rocketed through to many days at 100% and operating 95%, 97% occupancy. And no doubt that has had a little bit of an impact, because there hasn't been any new additional stock coming through to the market in 2020. Let's say there's probably been a little bit, but not like it was before. And they will see that going forward. So that whole, reducing supply and increasing demand that we're talking about nationwide for the PRS, it's happening in our little microeconomies as well.
I think you're right in terms of the squeeze on the sector. In the absence of additional stock, it's a problem. And it's like us as a letting agent, we need more houses, and there's not enough houses for us to market and fill. So we're forced to increase the prices, which landlords are happy about that because they make a little bit more money. But we need more stock, and I think councils need more housing stock as well to be able to supply rooms or apartments or houses for people on their waiting lists, and just so the local economy functions. For people coming in for work, to relocate to the area, et cetera, et cetera. So at some point, this becomes a bit of an issue. I mean, I know within probably certain departments, there's some people that weren't keen on Article 4, but, our wise councillors obviously wanted it. They've been pushing it for some time. So it'd be interesting to see what actually happens. And, as you said, we've increased our prices, which can't be good for the affordability part of that equation. HMOs are supposed to be affordable accommodation. They're still affordable, but they're slightly less affordable because there's less supply. So that's basic economics in terms of the way it works.
Okay, so going forward then, in spite of everything we've discussed, or alongside everything we've discussed, where should our listeners be looking to invest over the next perhaps 6 to 12 months in terms of area, strategy? I mean, we're still buying and will always be buying. That's just the nature of our business. But where would we recommend, or what would we recommend that other investors are doing right now? I
see stuff happening around the country, and I speak to agents around the country. And it's no different in Stoke or Crewe. There's an underlying demand for houses, and there's not enough housing stock to let out or to sell, for that matter. So that puts a price squeeze, and that's reflected in rents and property values. Now, that can't continue forever, but when it ends, nobody knows. Maybe as interest rates rise, that's going to reduce that demand some. But I think in terms of Stoke, Newcastle and Crewe, I think you can buy pretty much anywhere and it will rent because of the demand. But it depends how much money you want to make. The last time I went out with some new investors, there were 3 potential deals that were done. One fell through. One was in Basford, a semi-commercial in Basford, a couple of flats on top of a nice retail shop. That was a good deal. There was another one in Crewe, outside the Article 4 area, which they're going to convert into an HMO. And another one where it was a small hairdresser, 2 flats. And when we sort of spoke to the agents in terms of demand, rental, what they could get for it, I mean, great. The only question remained is the uplift after the works and how much money you can take out as a result. Could you invest 150 grand or a couple of 100,000 and see an uplift to 200 grand or 250,000 at the end of the works? And that takes a little bit of time. That doesn't happen overnight. But in terms of good rents, brilliant. So I would say just about anywhere is rentable. So it's a matter about buying something at the right price. I know we know some people who are doing some stuff on London Road, too far away from our property, and that'll work well. That'll go great guns when it's finished, because they do a nice job. Those rooms or apartments will be snapped up straight away. I think it's a good time. I always say, and we were talking about this before the podcast, my attitude has always been, if you're looking to buy on Monday, sell on Tuesday, and get your money back, if it's a rental, and get your money back by Friday, then you might be disappointed. But if you're a long-term investor, long-term for me is 10 years. For other people, maybe they can't see past 5 years. But let's just say, if you're looking at a 5 to 10 year horizon, then you should be buying all day, every day. Yeah. Because even if you buy near the top of the market, it'll iron itself out over a period of time. We continue to be very bullish on property, not irresponsibly bullish. We're always looking for a deal. But, where, it's okay to sell, take a profit, nothing wrong with that. But we continue to add to the portfolio. We'll continue to do so going forward because we're seeing some growth in values, in Crewe, where Stoke as well, in terms of people that we know that have sold and they've got some good prices for their HMOs and stuff. But the rentals are hardening. We're getting good rents. We're comfortably over the 500 for an ensuite. 2 years ago, we didn't think that would be the case. 2 years ago, it was 450. So it's gone up by almost 20% in 2 years, 8% a year or something like that. I mean, that's, pretty darn good. Set some of these energy prices that we're seeing, and, we got to work hard to manage people in houses for that. But I think long term, I'm always very, very optimistic with regard to our area and property in general.
And I think it's about controlling the things that you can control and not getting too overwhelmed by the things that you can't. Just talking about then in terms of the energy prices, we've rolled out around 15 or so new thermostats in the last couple of weeks, and we'll probably do another 10 or 15 before the end of this month, where we are now, controlling, let's say, 80% of the activity in the house. Obviously, there's an element of boosting that can take place inside, but, control the things that we can control. We can give our feedback to the government, but we can't control it. So what will be, will be. But it is about holding for the long term. I completely agree with that. I had a conversation with a gentleman over the phone the other day, and he was perhaps in his 70s and he'd bought property all his life. And he said to me, at some point, Amanda, you need to think about at what point you will stop and what you will do. And I said, I can't think about that right now. That's not even in my horizon, Valid point, but that's definitely not in my 5 to 10 year plan.
I mean, everybody needs an exit strategy.
Yeah.
Because their life evolves. But, most people have some sort of legacy they want to pass on. And I think we should never forget that what we do is also a service to the local community.
Absolutely.
And, I think our governments pay lip service to that. I think our associations pay lip service to that, although they're supposed to represent that. I'm not a fan of the national associations. I think they're weak and the government rides roughshod over them. But we do a invaluable service to the community by providing housing. We provide 20% of the nation's housing stock. So 1 in 5. And I think it's underestimated. For that, we go through a lot of trouble. We invest, we upgrade. Yeah, there's some bad actors who don't do what they're supposed to do. But all in all, we do a pretty darn decent job. A lot of the big boys are coming in doing their build to rent. But yeah, we're happy to come in because the country needs as much stock as possible. Their prices are probably 30% higher than your typical local landlord, but they're offering more facilities. And, there's a role for them. But, housing is a basic need. You go back to the psychologist, is it Maslow? Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
And, housing, a roof over your head, is the first rung of the ladder. And we provide that. So apart from the money that's made, we're providing a very, very important service for the community that we operate. And I always urge even some of our overseas investors that come to Stoke and Crewe, I always try and urge them to think of it not in terms of just a financial investment, but also into the local housing need and providing housing for people locally, rather than just a transaction on a sheet of paper.
Okay, so let's look into the future a little bit. Let's look at, say, 12, 18, 24 months. Where do we see the housing market, property businesses, and operating in our area? What do you think, Paul?
I mean, let's get the old crystal ball out and shine it up a little bit. It's a funny time. I mean, property in terms of values have obviously done well, notwithstanding what we've gone through the pandemic and not being able to collect rents. Now that's off the table. Rents have hardened. Where the world economies are going through or approaching this stagflation, they call it, where economies are stagnant and prices are rising, hence inflation, which is a bit of a double whammy. What normally happens if I put my economist hat on is that people turn to hard assets. That's commodities and generally property. The challenge with that is that interest rates are increasing as well. The Bank of England and the government have a tricky job in terms of, not tipping the economy too far over where things just grind to a halt and people start talking about the R word, recession. At the same time, they need to get inflation down, and they do that by increasing interest rates. So it's a bit tricky to forecast the next 24 months. I think in our business, a strategy is always hope for the best, plan for the worst. So I'd be fixing any tracker mortgages that we have. I'd be fixing those on a 3 or 5 year decent rate and advising other people to do the same. I'd be just doing a little bit of belt tightening, making sure that things are running the way they're supposed to, keep an eye on all the costs, as a lot of landlords already do. But I think reiterating that to our tenants on a national basis, I think house prices will taper off going into 2023 as things really start to bite. Inflation isn't 6 or 7%. Inflation is double that. You can tell that in supermarkets. You can tell that when you buy petrol. They're talking about interest rates going up to probably 2%, base rates going up to 2% by the end of the year. If you work on the basis that at the beginning of this year is 0.1%, and that's going to go up to 2%. So that's quite a hefty jump. So what you do know, if inflation is real inflation is at least 12%, what you do know is that you're not going to get a 12% salary rise. People are paying more taxes, more national insurance. So I think that's bound to have a little bit of effect on property. Now, there's always a silver lining to this. There's always opportunities that come out of this. And for those people that are liquid or are cash rich, there may be properties that they can pick up from businesses that want to sell up. Retailers had a tough time. They've bounced back a little bit, but they might have another tough time. If they don't have a good Christmas, that could be curtains for a lot of outlets. Manufacturing, distribution, just with all the logistical problems that Cumber's been having, that could cause problems. And there could be buildings up for grabs for developers to turn them into something else. It's not a very nice thing to say about businesses going under and stuff like that. Not at all. We're a business ourselves. But as developers, that's the business that we're in. We develop empty buildings. We convert buildings that are no longer fit for purpose. Something hovering by 2025 is the whole EPC changes for both commercial and residential. And that could be a bit of a challenge because with the old terrace houses, trying to get up to level C is not too easy. We're at E at the moment. We can probably get to a D as a minimum, but jump to that C, it's almost like knocking the whole house down and rebuilding it again. What I understand for commercial property, that's even worse. Try and get that EPC rating up 2 levels. It's really, really expensive to do for commercial. We've had a lot of changes with HMOs, licensing, planning, tax changes over the last 4 or 5 years. We've got the whole right to rent. We forget that we're now immigration officers. The next thing the government's going to say, you need to book flights for people that aren't allowed to rent property to fly them to another country in Africa or somewhere. I don't know what the government's going to come out with next in trying to get us as landlords to do stuff. So we've been through a lot of change.
All right.
But we're resilient.
Yeah.
We're resilient. We're like the bricks and mortar. As landlords, we're like bricks and mortar. We last for a long time, So even though there might be some more change afoot going forward in our sector, if you believe in property, you'll always stay in property.
Yeah.
If you believe even among carnage, there's going to be opportunities. And I always say you always have to have gust of opportunity when comes your way. We're eyeballs on the ground, so we'll be looking and we'll be sharing that through the podcast and through other means in terms of when we think things are ripe. So, my favorite term is I'm cautiously optimistic. Probably a little bit more cautious at the moment because there's a lot of unknowns. I don't think we can underestimate what's happening in Ukraine to influence. I know Crew Council are looking for properties or inspecting properties for Ukrainians to come and live in and stuff like that. We don't know what impact that's going to have on local housing stock legislation, the economy, and even shortages of a whole bunch of stuff, gas and all that sort of stuff. I read something the other day, right, that if the gas situation becomes really bad and Mr. Putin cuts off the gas to our part of the world, things could be on rations. So you never know. It's a bit unknown. But what I do know is that we're resilient as landlords, as property owners, as property developers. So cautiously optimistic, I think. Cautiously optimistic.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we will end our podcast for this evening. As Paul says, we'll endeavour to keep our listeners updated in our ever-changing marketplace. When you said there about what's changed in the last 5 years, there is just so much, and that doesn't even cover things like inside the properties with changes to electrical regulations and upgrades, and there's so much stuff going on. And we just say yes, we just say, okay, fine, yeah, we'll get that certificate and we'll fill in that form and we'll do that survey and we'll register here and we'll apply for this license there. And we just say yes, 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 and yes, because that's what we do as good landlords. And we carry on in spite of. Mm-hmm. We carry on in spite of. All right, good stuff. Well, good podcast, good session. And we will update our listeners throughout our next episodes. Thank you for listening.
Great stuff. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if so, please hit subscribe and share with those who you think would enjoy it too. To get in touch with Paul and Amanda directly, please visit their website www.essentialpropertyoptions.co.uk for more information. We look forward to sharing with you on the next episode.